An IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, report says only swift and drastic action can avert irrevocable damage to the world. The comprehensive report on the climate crisis took hundreds of scientists 8 years to compile and runs to thousands of pages. Half of the global population now experiences severe water scarcity for at least part of the year.
The future really is in our hands. We will, in all probability, reach around 1.5 degrees early next decade. But after that, it really is our choice.
These impacts are increasing rapidly as we have failed to reverse a 200-year trend of rising greenhouse gas emissions. Monday's final installment, called the Synthesis Report, is the last assessment while the world still has a chance of limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. China's Xi Jinping has met with Vladimir Putin in Moscow days after an arrest warrant was issued for the Russian leader. China has never condemned Mr. Putin and has refrained from using the term invasion to describe the Russian leader's war in Ukraine. Both countries are part of BRICS, a group of the world's leading emerging market economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Neither Moscow nor Beijing is a member of the ICC, who the Kremlin describes as outrageous and legally void. With Russian forces struggling in Ukraine, Beijing faces a choice it had hoped to avoid, according to Jonathan Eyal of the Royal United Services Institute. Either they do nothing and risk seeing Russia humiliated in Ukraine, which is not in China's interest, or they come to Russia's aid and risk a much bigger deterioration in their relationship with the West. Mr. Johnson has admitted that he misled Parliament about COVID rule-breaking, but insisted his denials were made in good faith based on what he honestly knew at the time. But senior Tory MP David Davis was scathing about the former Tory PM, saying that his defence was bollocks and that he predicts Boris will be found guilty and punished. A suspension of more than 10 days could trigger a by-election in his Uxbridge and South Ruislip seat, though the committee are not expected to deliver a verdict until May. Mr. Davis added, Mr. Johnson should have checked the advice with the Cabinet Secretary and Permanent Secretaries at departments in charge of the restrictions. After all, these were rules he authorised. The former Prime Minister lashed out at the committee of MPs investigating whether he lied to Parliament, accusing the cross-party group of being absurd, illogical and partisan. When asked, Dominic Cummings said that Rishi Sunak's team will have access to more damaging material in government that would smash Mr. Johnson's chances of returning. The Metropolitan Police is broken and rotten, suffering collapsing public trust, and is guilty of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia, an official report has said. The report by Louise Casey, commissioned by the Met after one of its officers abducted Sarah Everard, taking her from a London street in March 2021 before raping and murdering her. The author of a landmark report says that the Met can no longer presume that it has the permission of the people of London to police them. Lady Casey's report warned that the public consent is broken with just 50% expressing confidence even before revelations are the force's worst recent scandals. The Met has yet to free itself of institutional racism. Public consent is broken. The Met has become unanchored from the Pelian principle of policing by consent set out when it was established. Home Office officials insist they have put police reform measures in place. Home Secretary Sula Braverman said it's clear that there have been serious failures of culture and leadership in the Met.
No one saw this coming. It's a lot worse than anyone expected. It means inflation's going the wrong way.
This is a surprise, and a shock as well as a surprise.
Big problem was food. Food prices are up 18.2% on a year-on-year basis. That's the highest we've seen since 1977. Seeing food prices rise this rapidly is quite shocking.
This really puts the Bank of England on the horns of a dilemma, and they have their next interest rate decision tomorrow. Ordinarily, you'd think inflation's going up again. Crikey, we need to raise interest rates to bear down on that. With all these market jitters and concerns about a fully blown banking crisis, the Bank of England is going to be really reluctant to put interest rates up. I think they'll take their cue from what the Federal Reserve does today.
There was widespread disruption across Israel today as Knesset approved a law designed to protect Netanyahu from future persecution. The legislation was approved early on Thursday after a heated all-night debate by 61 votes to 47, the minimum majority required. Netanyahu said, "We can't let any disagreement, however fierce, endanger our joint future. To avoid a rift in the people, each side must take seriously the claims and concerns of the other." Israel's newly elected government, made up of far-right and religious parties, introduced the amendment in February. Among the other plans for the judiciary are bills that would give politicians control over appointments to Israel's Supreme Court and severely curtail its ability to overturn laws.
I expect today you'll say anything to avoid this outcome. Like you are 100% responsible for what TikTok does. That you suddenly endorse a national data privacy standard. That Project Texas is more than a marketing scheme. That TikTok doesn't harm our innocent children.
A testy congressional hearing on Thursday started after a bipartisan push to ban the app entirely in the U.S. over national security concerns. Xiao Zhichu has remained largely out of the public limelight as the social network's popularity continues to soar. Questioning got off to a forceful start with members of the committee grilling Chu on his connection to ByteDance, who lawmakers say have ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Chu's claims of independence from the Chinese government were undermined by a Wall Street Journal story published that said China would strongly oppose any forced sale of the company. Republican Congressman Gus Belarus shared the story of Chase Nazca, a 16-year-old boy who killed himself a year ago by stepping in front of a train. King Charles's visit to France postponed as anti-Macron rioters scrawl "Death to the King" on monuments. The macabre message was left by protesters rioting against the French president's decision to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. Over 450 people, so far, have been arrested after nationwide demonstrations have crippled public transport and services and seen rioters set fire to piles of uncollected rubbish. I think it would not be responsible and would lack some common sense if we invited His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort for a state visit in the midst of the demonstrations, Mr. Macron said. Senior politicians including Mr. Macron had received threats evoking the historical use of the guillotine to execute Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the last rightful king and queen of France. The monarch's trip next week with his wife Camilla, the Queen Consort, was to be his first abroad since becoming king. UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, met with Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu at Downing Street on Friday. But the joint press conference had to be cancelled due to hundreds of protesters including Israelis living in London and British Jews gathered outside 10 Downing Street. Protests are being held weekly across Israel against legislation being pushed through the Knesset by the government to restrain the judiciary. Demonstrators shouted "Shame" in Hebrew as Netanyahu's convoy arrived. They held signs saying "Dictators are not welcome" and "Sunak, do not let Bibi turn Israel into another Iran." Critics of the reforms say that Netanyahu's new plans could dampen not only the country's social structure but also harm the security of Israel. These reforms have been created as Netanyahu himself faces another trial for corruption, a charge he denies. Gwyneth Paltro has denied in court that she caused a 2016 ski collision in Utah that the man suing her says has left him with life-changing injuries. Terry Sanderson, 76, says the Hollywood actress caused the crash. He is seeking damages of $300,000, £244,000. Ms. Paltrow has countersued for a symbolic £1, testifying that he collided with her and left her feeling hurt and violated. Lawyers for Mr. Sanderson say Ms. Paltrow was distracted by her children on the slope and fled the crash. According to his civil lawsuit, Mr. Sanderson suffered a lasting brain injury and 4 fractured ribs. There was a body pressing against me and a very strange grunting noise, Paltrow said, describing how Mr. Sanderson, a retired eye doctor, crashed into her from behind on a beginner's slope at Deer Valley in February 2016. A head teacher who took her own life ahead of a school inspection report was under intolerable pressure, her family has said. Ruth Perry was waiting for an Ofsted report that would rate her primary school in Reading as inadequate. The family statement said, "We do not for an instant recognize Ofsted's inadequate judgment as a true reflection of Ruth's exemplary leadership or of the wonderful school she led. An inquest this summer will fully investigate Ms. Perry's death, but the publication of the Ofsted report has triggered a debate about whether single grades for schools make sense. Out of 359 schools previously rated outstanding, 219 have seen their ratings drop, with 5 having fallen to the bottom category of inadequate. A petition calling for changes to the system has so far gathered more than 200,000 signatures. Vladimir Putin has said Russia plans to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, marking Moscow's latest attempt to use the threat of a nuclear war to ramp up tensions with the US and NATO over the invasion of Ukraine. Russia's president said work would be completed on building storage units for tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus on July 1, 2023. Though Putin said Russia would not transfer control of the tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus or violate its nuclear non-proliferation obligations. The decision is one of the Kremlin's most significant steps with its arsenal since it invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Putin said the deployment was in response to a request from Belarus's autocratic leader Alexander Lukashenko, who has allowed Russia to use the country as a launch pad for attacks on Ukraine. Putin has regularly made veiled threats to use all the means at our disposal to defend Russia's territorial conquests and warn off Western support for Ukraine's military. Tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets in anger and rage after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fired his defense minister. Mr. Gallant spoke out against the law on Saturday, where he said members of the Israeli Defense Forces were angry and disappointed. Mr. Netanyahu, who was out of the country at the time of Mr. Gallant's TV appearance, said he no longer had faith in him as defense minister. After he was fired, Mr. Gallant took to Twitter to reaffirm, "The state of Israel's security has always been and will always be my life's mission." Israel's opposition leader, Yair Lapid, described Mr. Gallant's sacking as a new low for the government. Netanyahu can fire Gallant, but he can't fire reality or fire the people of Israel who are fronting up to resist the coalition's madness,